Black faith involved in the project. National Clearinghouse on.
Thank you. And the chair of our board, Pastor Jefferson.
Hi, I'm Pastor Danny Jefferson, pastor of the Rehoboth World Outreach Center Church here in the city of Vallejo, and as was stated, the chair of the board for Elite, and very much advocate for our community in the city of Vallejo. Glad to be here.
Thank you. So you know the story of how Elite came to be. Really, we're uniquely positioned to eliminate the opportunity gap. And we call it opportunity gap because achievement gap makes it seem like there's something wrong with our young people. Opportunity is given the opportunity, all of our young people can succeed. So Elite is uniquely positioned and created to eliminate the opportunity gap for Black and brown students. Why is a school like this so important in Vallejo, but more importantly, in any so-called urban community?
Would you like me to respond first?
I would love that as the education.
Well, I've been thinking about this question for some time, and I want to take us back historically to 1860. 1860, Vallejo, which should have been the capital of the state, established segregated. And so for a time, for a significant time, and if you think about the very beginning of the education system in Vallejo, it was segregated. It wasn't until 1911 that the schools we had our first African-American school. And it wasn't in a schoolhouse. It was in a hotel in downtown Vallejo. So you have Black children being educated in a room in a hotel and white children who are educated in schoolhouses. So you already see this disparity happening. My grandmother, so my family is from Vallejo. My great-grandmother, my grandmother, they moved to Vallejo in about 1935. And as part of my study, I interviewed my grandmother. What she told me about her educational experience break your heart, which is that she was called the N-word by her teachers and classmates. She was paraded around the principal's office with another teacher there and humiliated, that rocks were thrown at her and she had to fight every day of her life and run home from school. But when I examine the educational experiences of other African Americans between 1910 and 1970 from my study of the Great Migration, I find very similar kinds of foreclosure of educational opportunity. So what I find is that African Americans are steered away from courses and college-going opportunities. They're steered into low-wage and service opportunities. We see Black men missing from education altogether. One of my participants shared that she found a lot of her classmates in the mental health hospital and not in educational systems at all. And then when you fast forward to the present day and you look at educational experiences and outcomes for Black and brown students, you start to see that this is a legacy of the city of Vallejo. We have high rates of suspension, high rates of absenteeism, high rates of dropout, and low rates of literacy and numeracy, which means our children are not having access to educational opportunity. They're not being given the opportunity to even see themselves as as appropriate for school, to freedom dream, as Bettina Love talks about, to think about, who do I want to be when I grow up? What could I possibly do? What could I contribute to the society? And many of our students don't even know how much their families have contributed to this community in terms of the economic development of the community, the cultural development. I wanted to share that to kind of launch us into this broad conversation about education opportunity. Briefly, Black and brown children have never since the history of the founding of this city had access to equitable educational opportunity.
You just dropped the mic. What can you say after that? You took us to school, because with being indigenous to Vallejo, a native, I had never. Now we lived it, but I had never heard that. But that was excellent. I'm so glad to hear that, and I'm sure our viewers, particularly those of us from Vallejo, gives us great context of where we are today. And it's a shame that in 2023 we're still in the same boat. We're still in the same situation. where one of the things I believe that Elite does so well is gives identity. Because, our identity is connected to our performance. If our identity is skewed, sometimes our performance follows who we think we are and what others say we are. And I can remember my own experience in school, um, which were many negative things. But I remember them saying, well, you're not going to college. Maybe you just do something else or whatever. But my mother was a school teacher. She was about 5 feet tall. She was a powerhouse, small in stature, but tall in everything else. And she said, oh, yes, absolutely. Everybody, you're a Daniels. That was her maiden name. You're a Daniels. At Daniels, we do this, we do that, and the other. So I had someone at home to encourage me and to kind of frame that identity. And I think that's what Elite does. There's a need for Elite because there is this absence that is in the public schools of that identity, and so often we are getting the wrong identity, which causes, I think, an array of other problems.
Well, I think to work from a meta perspective, Vallejo, history of our nation, education, fraught, examples given. Indeed, I think the importance of Elite and institutions like it around the country is you cannot depend on liberation.
That's right.
And to connect the dots with what both of you have said, it takes me back to people like Franz Fanon and Paulo Freire. A place like Elite has to create new consciousness. When you've been under oppressive circumstances so long, it can grind into the DNA low expectations. And it becomes self-enslaving. That's ingrained trauma. And so I know one of the things we talked about early in the formulation was the relationship between mental health and engaging in trauma-informed educational processes. We often talk about cultural-informed education, but when your culture has been steeped in abuse and neglect, you have to move beyond just what the cultural informed says to the trauma informed. And I think there is no doubt that the beautiful history you laid out, when I came to Vallejo, I got involved in these issues because there were children being locked in closets, literally, being locked in closets. There were teachers using the N-word. This is not 10 years ago. And when we saw the Trump wave that rode through our school board election, we had the same virulent racism. The other part that I would speak to just a little bit, thinking of Franz Fanon, is the sort of ingrained self-acceptance that some of our communities have had. That our battle to create Elite was not just for the forces outside of our community. There were some inside of our community who benefit from being facilitators, that their positions as prompt mediators help to maintain the status quo. And so there are times in which we have an internal conversation and an internal battle about what do our children deserve? And how do our children get what they deserve, lest we advocate? And when you have generation after generation that's been trained to stay in their place, someone like a Dr. Bishop or like a Pastor Jefferson, you need outside agitation. People with vision to see beyond what has been normalized. And I think that's the most painful part of not just what our city suffers, but of cities across the country, that we have normalized our condition. And in so doing, accepted the status quo. I think Elite breaks that cycle and says we deserve better, we'll fight for better, and we deserve to see our own educated above the par.
You know, a thought comes to mind as I'm listening to the theme of what you're talking about, and that's integration of school systems. Zora Neale Hurston wrote a letter to the Orlando Sentinel to fight against integration of school systems. So can you talk about the impact that you believe integration has had on whether it's Vallejo or beyond? Was this a good idea? And if not, what should we have done to get what we wanted at that time?
I'm going to start again. I don't think the Black community wanted integration at the time. They wanted equitable educational resources, but they weren't necessarily agitating for complete integration of schools. So we know that what it did, right? We know historically what it did was we lost a number of African American educators and educational leaders. There's a generation that didn't get to lead schools and didn't get to share their wealth of knowledge, their love for education, love for young people, their history. And so, I mean, that's a complete loss, because now what we're talking about is how to get Black and brown educators and educational leaders in school. Well, when integration happened, there was an intentional firing or not hiring of us. And so I think that's a particular kind of loss, but also the kind of cultural understandings and ways of doing school that were common to our community, because Black educators were from the community, of the community. They knew the parents. When you read Booker T. Washington, even though he's problematic in some ways, but when you read education books by folks who were doing school during the time before integration, what you hear is that, or what you learn is that Black educators were in the communities, knowing the parents. They knew the pastors, community. They were all integrated. It wasn't this separate system. And so oftentimes what I have to do with my own students is get them to understand the educational context in which they're teaching, because they drive into the communities and they don't live there, and then they drive out. But before integration, we didn't have that. Your principal was from the community. He knew your mama, he knew the pastor, he knew the shop owners, etc. So he didn't have to get this kind of, or she didn't have to get this kind of educational understanding, because they were always part of the community, and they were greatly and widely respected as well. The children could trust them, that they had their interests at heart. And remember, I told you the story of my grandmother. Part of her story is a story about integration. It's going to the principal's office, who she describes as a white Jewish man, but whoever he was, he humiliated her. And so this was not the kind of thing that was happening in Black and brown schools at the time, right? So pulling a child out of school, sending her to the office, having her walk around. She describes it like being in a circus, like she was a monkey in a circus, fearful. And then, she had to go to the office. She didn't have a choice. Was integration helpful for us? Well, I don't think so. I'll just go on the record and say, I don't think so. I was educated in Oakland in high school, in a school much like Elite. I was educated with a Black principal, a Black counselor. Most of my teachers were Black, and it was required for us to apply to college. There was this kind of Black excellence that was going on that wasn't, that was so special to me. All of my classmates were smart. I wasn't some exceptional person. I think that's what's happened nowadays, is when you don't have folks who understand that Black people are smart, it's the parceling off of some groups of people. I'm gonna stop here because I know that y'all have more to say.
When I was listening to you, I was thinking about my own grandmother, who lived in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and was a a political powerhouse of her own in the 40s. She was the state president of the PTA. She was the mother's mother, you know. And Governor Farbus at the time was the governor of Arkansas, who was, you know, a tremendous advocate of segregation, was trying to deal with, at that time, it was Arkansas A&M, but it's now University of Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And he was trying to fire the president of the institution at that time, and she and a lot of mothers came together and rallied around and rallied the governor's office and said, no, you're not going to fire this man. You know, he's our person. And story goes that he left him there in place. But she often said that we don't want to integrate our schools. And I remember hearing my mother have this conversation. It was strange to me with being a child of integration. And she said, we don't want to integrate our schools because our teachers are going to lose their jobs, just as you stated. Our principals are going to lose their jobs. And there's going to be this tremendous gap, if you will, of all of these folks that are going to lose their jobs, and our children are going to eventually be the greatest losers. And so she was not an advocate for integration. So has it hurt us? I definitely think it did, and I think that we didn't realize how it was going to divide us as a community. So now we're so divided as a community. When we were more together, we're now separated. And I think that separateness now, everybody's in the individual. We don't see ourselves as a collective as we once did when we were all together. Every man for himself. So therefore, it's difficult to have a dynamic of unity to accomplish certain things because it's about what will affect my home. We're not concerned about other people. And I think that mentality came out of integration, which has certainly hurt us as a people.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question from a social science perspective because I think you have to define who the us is, right? In the history of American thought around being black and how we fit into society, the popular typology is accommodationists versus, agitators, right? There were some who wanted segregation. Wanted integration, and that was typically along class lines. And I think we've seen it play out along class lines, right? And so many, like Dr. King, did not understand the class issues early on because he came from a very upper class background. Integration did not seem as odd to him. He had some exposure to folks already. Even his future wife at Boston University had already been in integrated spaces. So integration for them meant something different than, say, your grandmothers, who did not have access to resources and wealth. So we've got to go back to Du Bois and the difference between Du Bois and Booker T and how they thought black liberation looked, right? Fast forward to today, many of us still don't feel that impact, right? We can send our children to certain schools, and we can buy houses in certain neighborhoods, and so we see black flight, right? And so we've been co-opted by it a little bit. And I think in that regard, integration has served the purpose it was intended to serve for the people who knew they could take advantage of it. And I think we have to now look backwards and say to ourselves, who are the we now? Right? That even the we now looks different. And I struggle with this. When I look at where I sit, right, and my own ethical responsibilities to my community, what are the benefits I have versus the people I say I'm working to free? And what am I willing to sacrifice to be in those spaces. And all of you all know that it's one thing for us to do late night basketball and to be here from 9 to 2 a.m. every weekend and to go back to a safe and secure home. That's different than the kids we leave, and once we wave goodbye, they are steeped still in insecurity. And I think the problem with answering that question is, depending upon where we're located in our micro context, it's been good for some. For some, it works, right? But if we don't see ourselves as this collective, if we take on Western sensibility, then we're going to answer that question differently. And I take your point to be this. I'm never comfortable, and we've said this before, if I don't love the kid that doesn't have my child's advantages, then that kid could impact me more than I can imagine or understand. And so we surrendered our status. In our early community, teachers, pastors, and undertakers were the most influential people in the black community, right? If you were a teacher, you had social status. And as I say now, no offense to my brothers and sisters who are plumbers, we'll pay a plumber 3 times as much as we'll pay a person charged with educating our future. And we've got to examine our common value. And therefore, elite, to me, is not a hearkening back, because our sort of political opponents will say, you just won't let our people into your school, which is not the case, right? As you know, black churches we were formed because we weren't allowed in other churches, but we always opened ourselves up to them. White people could always come to a black church, right? And be treated with love. I think our schools are like that. I don't think anybody's put a sign up and said, no white people allowed in elite, right? I think what we've got to ask ourselves is, what is our corporate responsibility to every child? And if we are committed to liberation, are we going to fight for children that are not in our immediate household with the same vigor that we will for children who are? I think that's the ethical question we have to answer now around integration. Where are we in the who? And what is our respective responsibilities?
One thing that's coming up when you're talking is this idea of a separate us, separate black community. When you were talking, I was thinking about, where are we in community with each other? Sometimes we're in the same schools, but we're often in community in so many other places. So in churches, in sororities and fraternities, in basketball and athletics. So we've never been like completely separated. But to your point, I think the neighborhood issue is real. And so those who could have moved out of predominantly black communities and have moved into more white and affluent communities. And so we're not in community in that way. And I think as someone who doesn't live in a mostly black community, but lives in a mixed community, one of the things my husband and I have talked a lot about is how much we miss living amongst our people. And if we had that opportunity, would we do that? And we are very, very strong advocates for that. So this question about integration, segregation means a lot to me too, because when we think about neighborhoods that were, how black neighborhoods were and have been historically, you had a range of classes within one neighborhood. We're segregated into one space, but we weren't always living the same kinds of lives, class-wise and resource-wise, but we were always at the same schools and the same organizations. And so I think that's what's missing nowadays from the black community, because we're still at church together. We're still doing all kinds of other things together, and we're still even in the same families. So I don't have to think about somebody else's kid somewhere who I don't know, an abstract kid. I can just think about my cousins, my siblings, their children, my nieces and nephews. When I think about what happens class-wise when Black people aren't in the same neighborhoods and therefore not in the same schools, it's a very personal question for me. I watched it happen growing up in Oakland when my parents moved to a more well-resourced neighborhood. And my mother, and I want to talk about why Black people do that too. My mother, growing up in Oakland, my mother grew up in San Francisco, but moving to Oakland and having a poor education, she didn't know fractions. That's how poor her education was. She was really hell-bent on making sure that we didn't have that same thing, that we were well prepared. And so she sent us from school to school and moved into a neighborhood where she thought we could have that kind of access. And so I don't think that when Black people are moving, maybe there are some people who are doing this, but I think what has happened is they're chasing resources that have been denied in our communities. And so I want to shift that conversation to what resources are being extracted from Black communities or not being poured into Black communities, and why. And we can see that, with the city of Vallejo, for example, and communities like Oakland. I lived in Woodland for a time, and I saw the difference in resources from one city to the next. Woodland next door to Davis, and how money was being, we weren't any more deserving, but how communities either band together to provide educational resources through bonds and other measures, parcel taxes, through PTAs who are fundraising. And so those are the things that are happening. And so Black people who are moving aren't trying to get away from other Black people, they're trying to provide education opportunity for their own children. And that's something that really breaks my heart, that we often have to leave our communities to be able to do that.
I love that, and I think it moves us, if we can continue to nuance it a little bit. Because I think we can talk about faith institutions if we go to church together, and again, I want to drill down to the we, right? Because I'm not sure we are the same that go to churches. There have always been blue chip churches, right, and low income churches. I think we've been much more segregated by class than we're willing to admit, because I think it's a painful conversation, right? I love being the pastor of First Baptist, but we are a blue chip church. The pastor has a PhD. The members are lawyers and doctors, and there's a certain enjoyment that the members have of that, right? And that's throughout our church history, right? It's Vincent Harding has noted that, right? That Du Bois has noticed that. When you study our institutions, they've always had this classism to them, right? That causes some of us anxiety, because I don't want to be known as such, even though I want to live as such, right? So there's this triple consciousness, I call it, right? This triple consciousness, because there's not only Du Bois' double consciousness, but then there is this sense, and I go back to Fanon, in which we are all striving to be successful, but success tends to in some ways separate us from where we started. And when we look at our organizations, right, when I got to New Jersey, people asked me, well, are you thinking about the boule, right? So I had to what is the boule, right? That's not, you're right, right? And when I left inner city Washington, D.C. and went to college, it was going to pledge. I had not heard of fraternities and sororities. That wasn't in my local context, right? So each level up the ladder exposed me to something that then from my cousins, when I go home, oh, you think you smart now. You're educated. So there's this sort of internal, and I want to, in our communities, there's things we don't say out loud, but we wrestle with, right? And I think part of what we have to do as it relates to mental health, and I'm going to keep going back to that, is in our institutions, whether we are in the upper class or middle class, because none of us are upper class. All of us are just 2 paychecks away from being put out of our house, right? We've got to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be happy and healthy? As an original question. No matter where we live, no matter where we went to school, or no matter how much, what does it mean to find fulfillment? And I love your use of the word community, right? We had this community all over the place, but our communities are shrinking, right? Our communities are shrinking. And we had a conversation before, our churches are closing. Well, what churches are closing, right? Churches that were most deeply entrenched in communities of need, and because the collective economics are struggling. So the reason I love your story, and I love you going back to your mother and your grandmother, is I think one major breakdown of our community is our responsibility to protect and provide for Black women. And I think that's the primary, beyond integration, our failure to support and protect Black women has been the greatest disadvantage of our community. And it's one of the things we committed to doing with Elite and 2 Black women who were under attack by a system. But
You know, I just wanted to add, as I was listening to you and thinking about Vallejo in particular, as a child of the 80s, that was when I graduated in 88, so I was at the end of the 80s. So as a child of the 80s, I think one aspect that we have not touched, a part of this integration, is it was generational. So even in the 80s, I can think of the principals, the lawyers, and all of these other folks that you're talking about were still in the Black community. But they were the older generation. The older generation stayed. They didn't go to the hills. They didn't go to the suburbs. They didn't go to those other areas. But the children of those folks did. That would be our generation and beyond. When we had an opportunity and all of these wonderful homes and things were being built and schools were being created and built, and opportunities that perhaps maybe our parents or forefathers did not have or did not select or choose. We chose them. So in some respect, we are part of that we too. We're part of the we, so we're not talking about somebody else. We're talking about us. So, because I can think about even my parents. We were the first African-American family in our community, and my mother actually moved out of South Vallejo because she said, we will have a tremendous influence on him, but we know that the surrounding area, the children that he's going to go to school with in some respect, and this community will have even a greater impact. So we moved to the other side of town. But historically in the city of Vallejo, probably all the way up to maybe 90, you still had that. But today, those communities look completely different. Not only have the Black community or those elite folks have moved out, but they've changed to others now. We have a different dynamic altogether. This community where this church sits does not reflect our nationality as it once did. It's a whole different environment. So we see gentrification, we see all these other things that are happening. Our folks have moved out, and these other folks have moved in and redeveloped these homes. You go into some of these homes, and you say, wow, look at this place. It's modern. You know, this house is the same house. They've gone and redone the kitchens and the bathrooms, and the other folks have moved in here, and now the prices have gone out to the degree that many of our people are priced out of even this area. So all of that is a part of integration as well. But thinking specifically of Vallejo, I have seen what you've talked about, even in this community, all the way up to the 80s.
So as a part of the we, I want to talk about, before I move on to the rest of the questions, I want to talk about how I got here. And I'd like the three of you to do the same. You've started to talk a little bit about it, but I'm going to go backwards to my grandmother and grandfather maternal. One a porter on the rail rig, and one a domestic. My grandmother went to school until she was 8, and then she cleaned houses. They had 5 children, my mother included. Every one of their children went to college. From no education to everyone educated. When it came to me, there was not a choice as to whether I was going to go to college. It was just, which college are you going to go to? You do that or you die. That's the choices you have. I remember my mother's decision to move from San Francisco. We lived in the Geneva Towers. They've been destroyed. To El Cerrito Hills. Why? Education. And then when it came to us, my family, we owned a home in Oakland. We moved to Sacramento, around junior high for my girls. Why? Education. And so I count myself as a part of the we, and I think it was interesting that you challenged us to think about this idea of, have you benefited from this system that has been created in our nation? Can you tell us your story? You made it. Every one of us is wearing some pretty nice shoes on our feet. That's where our students start. They go from here up. Tell us your story. How did you make it? What was the pinnacle for you?
Well, I'm a 4th-generation Californian. My family's been here a long time. My 4th generation on my mom's side. My mother's, my great-grandmother, we'll start there, Big Mama Hester, came from Missouri to LA, and then eventually up this way to Vallejo. And she dies in Vallejo in 1971. I don't know how much education she had, but she was born in the 1800s. She cleaned. When I look up, I'm a hobbyist genealogist, and she worked for the Greyhound bus station. She's a custodian, but she also makes moonshine, if you know that story. And she eventually buys a house. My mother said that she bought a house in Vallejo. I guess the mayor at the time was on her block, so they felt very proud of her. My great-grandfather, so this is my great-great-grandmother. So my great-grandfather comes here. He ends up moving to San Francisco eventually, but he's here where this is where my grandmother grows up in part till she's about middle school age. So my family's here for many generations. My uncle still lives here. Got a bunch of cousins around the Vallejo, Fairfield area. I don't think anyone's in Vacaville, but general area. But my mother, because my grandmother eventually goes to high school in San Francisco, and my mother grows up in part in San Francisco and then Oakland. And then when I'm born, I'm not born in Oakland, but I grew up in Oakland. So and the way I got here is, I think it's 3 people primarily. My grandmother telling me from a very young age, because she and my mom had children before they were 21, and so they didn't go to college. My grandmother always told me, you could get married and have babies when you can't do anything else, get your education. So she said that to me repeatedly, over and over and over again. And it was this kind of like, we believe in you, we see you, we think you can do it. Something that her own father started. My grandfather went to UCLA but never finished his degree. So he's got 2 years of college in the 20s before Jesse Owens is there. And I think he doesn't finish in part for two reasons. One is because the depression happens, and the other is because my grandmother is with child, and it's not feasible economically for him to do college and work and fatherhood. But the other person I would credit making it, besides the educators who helped me, is my mom. My mom had a poor quality education. She graduated from high school, went to some community college, but she always was looking out for different schools for me. So as a kid, they put me in the gifted program, and she just when I would tell her something wasn't working for me education-wise, she actually believed me. She always listened to me. And so she always, if something didn't work, she found another place for me to be. And so I wasn't ever like stuck in a place. And so if I had to catch a bus or a couple of buses, which is what I did, that's what I did to get an education. And then lastly, my father. My father, who's no longer with us, was a tremendous man. He was the smartest man I knew. He had gone to high school, went to college, went to an HBCU on the East Coast, didn't finish because he, as he would say, he's a self-proclaimed knucklehead, but he always was there for me when I was in school. He was a whiz at math. And if I struggled with it, I could call my dad. But my dad also showed up at my high school. He was an older man, older than most dads. So when I would go to school, they would say my grandfather was there. He had white hair like I have now in his 30s. But Dad was always just popping up, so I had to be there because if I wasn't there and he was there, it was going to be a problem. He had me write down my schedule of where I was going to be, but my parents were on me. I had loving parents. My parents were divorced, but they were really pushed education. And then in my neighborhood, my across the street neighbor, remember we were talking about the 80s? I'm a child of school in the 80s too. I was like, we must be close to the same age. When I was doing research for the Great Migration Study, I started looking at my own experience with the Great Migration. So across the street from me, I'll never forget this man, Grady Leatherman, would give me my neighbor, Grady Leatherman, who's from Louisiana. I was surrounded by the Great Migration. On my block, in my schools, all the Black people were great migrants. And he would reward all the children on the block with money for grades. So if you got an A, he gave you money. It wasn't really the money, it was the pride. It was like all these people believing in you community-wise. And so the other great migrants were my teachers. I told you I went to a kind of a charter school for high school. I realized when I looked through, my social studies teacher, Mr. Solomon Wheat, who's no longer with us, he was a great migrant. He was an example for us. I could name all of my teachers and educators, every one of them great migrants who shaped my life. That's how I'm here. It's, people sewing into me, and it's the thing I get to do as an educator at CSU East Bay. I get to sow into the future educators who then sow into the children and into the community.
Well, I too am a child of the Great Migration. My father came in the 40s, as most people did during the war. This West Coast was full of, naval shipyards, Air Force bases, and so on and so forth. And so that's how most African Americans came during the 40s. And so my father was in Arkansas, lived in Arkansas, and had challenges for employment, and they said, well, they're shipping people to Chicago, to Detroit, and to a place called Vallejo in California. And they said, where do you want to go? He says, I think I'm going to go to Vallejo. I'm going to go to Vallejo. And he got on a train. Didn't know anybody in California, as most people did who migrated to California, and the rest is history. My mother was teaching in Arkansas and wanted to go to UC Berkeley. I had two uncles here, and they said, why don't you come out to California and go to school at Berkeley? Education was free in those days. They didn't have no loans or anything like that. If you just wanted, if you could get in, you could get your education. And so she came out and started teaching at Portland Junior High School there in El Cerrito. And so I would say that she has been the major person who has influenced me. Like your story, there was no question about whether I was going to college. It was about where I was going to college. I grew up with cousins who were well, I was always the youngest person because my parents had me late in life. I relate to having older parents. My father was born in 1911, and my mother was born in 1924, somewhere like that. So you can imagine, they were much older. And in doing so, they definitely wanted to make sure. One of the things my mother would always say is you're Daniels, it goes back to identity, and we that are on the West Coast cannot allow the Southern folks who are doctors, lawyers, and everything else for you not to do what they're doing. She was determined because it seemed like all the folks that came to California did not achieve, which I think is another subject. And another conversation, somehow or another, we in black folks here in California, abandoned in some cases some of our traditions and things that the folks back in the South did. Anyway, that's just my opinion. I'm sure there's some data on it somewhere. Y'all quote it for me. But that's my history. My history is coming from folks that came through the Depression and who migrated from the South during World War II. And looked for a better way for their children and grandchildren, and they inspired me to go to college. And so, because my mother and all of her siblings, like yours, my grandfather was a porter on the Cotton Belt, I think it's called something else now, and my grandmother had 10 children. She didn't have time to go do anything with anybody, but all of her children were college educated. Every one of them. And so they instilled in their children, which would be my generation, to go to school. And so that's been my history.
I feel like the odd person out. I'm not from California. I'm the transplant, which allowed me to see California and Vallejo very different. I brought a perspective here that always made me a little strained in some way when we had these conversations, right? I'm from Washington, D.C., and my family was primarily on the East Coast. I went to college in Atlanta at Morehouse. Education brought me here to do a PhD. And I think it was the drive when I got here to do the PhD. I had children and had to provide for them. But because of my interest, I always ended up in communities that were trying to fight through something to get somewhere. My first church was in the Tenderloin, right, in San Francisco, right? And, that was an interesting challenge. And I've always felt this need to be in places like that because my grandmother cleaned the White House. And the person whom the movie The Butler was made after lived across the street from us. And so I was raised around these older working class people who were cleaning places to send us to school. And they would always tell us, you have a responsibility. You're going to school because you have to come back and take care of our people. And so that's always been in my head, right? That whether it was Princeton or Atlanta or Berkeley, I'm not doing this for me. I got to go back. And that drove me to Vallejo. And as you all know, made it very difficult to leave. I agonized over that because I loved the work we did here. It gave me life. Not just because my children could take advantage of it, but because, when we were doing late night basketball, I felt like we were keeping one of these kids from getting shot. That every time a police officer found out a kid's name, we were keeping that kid alive. And I could hear my grandparents, my grandfather drove a cab, and everything was racist to him. He was a Washington Redskins fan, and if the referee made a bad call against the Redskins, it's because he was racist. And I'd be like, well, Granddad, he's black. He's like, he don't like himself. You know, it was all about race. So I grew up in a race environment, right? And I was educated, right? I was educated. You are a race person. And coming to California, I realized every mile of the Great Migration, this is my theory, and a couple of books have been written on this, we shed a bit of our cultural DNA. So every mile we came, and the further we went away, those anchor institutions that taught us who we were, right? Church and these schools where generations had been teachers, we were moving further and further away from that. And as we moved further and further away, those anchor institutions became younger and younger. And as they got younger and younger, they could not communicate the same history. So when I lived in Georgia, where we went to school, everybody knew who their great-great-grandmother was in Georgia. And they knew what house they were born in. And they knew, when you get to California, history started in 85, right? And you go, no, that's not when history started. Where are you from, right? And even the formation of churches in Vallejo, one church was formed because people who came from Texas went to Second Baptist, and people who came from Louisiana went to Friendship, and people went. So they gathered in their initial communities. We just didn't tell the stories. So generations came up who said, I'm from here. This is not where you're from. Where are you from? Who are your people? And I think that's the interesting thing about your question, right? A people without history are a lost people, right? When your history starts today, there's nothing to anchor you. And I think it's important, as you talk about your mom and dad and your grandparents, and, you know, all of us, we came from somewhere. And where we came from made us important. And nobody couldn't tell us we weren't important. And what saddens me is all the time we spent with our kids here, I spent in the camps, to hug people, hug kids, and they stiffen up when you hug them. And it brings you to tears, and you're like, what's wrong? And they were like, well, you know, I ain't used to people hugging me. Where'd that start? And I think we've got to connect family with identity, and identity with progress. Yeah.
There's a little bit of history into that. Why? So for many generations, well, I won't say generations, for many years, I didn't know the history. I just knew we were from these places. And so when I remember before my father passed, asking him a story about his stories. Now, I knew a lot by then. I had done some genealogy work. But I think part of what's not being shared is the pain. Because what's unique about California Black people is they were running from somewhere often. So if your people are in Atlanta, you didn't run from a thing. You're in the community. You've been there for generations. We went to Alabama in February to visit my husband's family. He's from Alabama. And they took us to the talked about the plantation they were from. We went to the family graveyard. I can do that on my dad's side. I want to be buried in Virginia, so if leave this for posterity. Send me back to my family's burial grounds in Powhatan, Virginia. But Black Californians, grandparents, I would say for now, our generation, because I know we're in the same generation, our grandparents didn't want to share that information because it hurt. And so I don't want this conversation to be ahistoric, because there's that pain too, where when I asked my dad and he said, I'm not going to tell you this, he was covering his pain. I found out some things. I don't know his particular thing, but I know a lot of our family story. And then, remember you were talking about Black women? We're the griots and storytellers. I'm a storyteller, too. I think you can figure that out by now. I thought I put that on silent. So in our tradition, we tell stories about our families. I know the history of Big Mama because my mother always told me that story. We didn't drill down to all the details, but there was certainly this piece of like Missouri, Sedalia, Missouri, Big Mama, and all her stories. My mother is terrific about that. She tells that Big Mama's been dead for 50 years, and we still hear her stories. I guess what I wanted to say about that is just to remember that there's a difference between us in California and us in the South, and that's the fleeing and the erasure of that pain. Because, you know, our family escaped in the dead of night from Louisiana because, according to our family law, our grandfather got into it with a white man and fled for his life. He's not telling that whole story anymore. Because one, he's probably, I mean, he's not with us anymore, but likely he is, doesn't want to relive it, and then also isn't fully over that. So I think that's a special, unique thing about California Black people. And then I want to say another thing about cultural ways. I don't agree with the assessment that we don't know where we're from and that we've lost all of it. I grew up not realizing how Southern I was until I really looked into what the culture was. So I'm a mixture of Louisiana, Arkansas, Port Arthur, Texas. That's what my mother's family, we got the one Missouri, but that's not really what her family culture is. When I think about the food I ate, how they talked, all of these things, when I go back south, it's so familiar because it's what I grew up with. I am not a Southern woman, but I have so many of those ways still because who raised me were people who were raised by Southern folks. I don't have the accent, but I have the you have the accent. Yeah. Well, your parents are from the South, right? I don't have it, but those other things are still with us. Even, you know, you think about whenever we get together and what were the restaurants we created out here. We had a bunch of Southern restaurants. We had greens. We had all these things that are very similar to what you would have had you grown up there. When I study my great migrants, I went to one woman's house. In her backyard was a garden, and this is very consistent across all of the great migrants. They all have gardens because they're all growing their cultural food. And you see that for all the migrant groups. Any immigrant from anywhere in the world, they're going to look for their cultural foodways. They're going to, you know, you talked about the churches that they created, churches for Louisiana and Texas and Arkansas, which are the three big communities here. So I just gently push back on that because I think that historical context is important when we think about what California Black is.
I love the diversity of thought and the banter and the moving back and forth with ideas that we have here today. It is powerful. And to my students, I want to tell you, this is how you fight, right? You use your words to argue ideas. Don't let anybody make you think that you have to put your hands on someone to express yourself. Argue ideas, issues. I'm going to move to the actual questions because that was, I took us away from where we were going, but I think it lays a great foundation for what it is that we are going to talk about next. Each of you are parents, multiple children. What is the best lesson you've learned about the importance of partnerships between school and home? And can you provide an example?
Well, I have 3 children who came through the school system here. One now is teaching at Elite, whom I'm very proud of. Also very proud of them being HBCU graduate and educated in Atlanta. Our philosophy in our home was that it didn't matter where they went to school as long as we were involved. We did not leave it up to the institution to fully educate our children. And my wife and I decided that we would be very much invested and involved in their school from TK all the way up, which we were. So how did that look? That looked like, when they came home, all right, it's homework time. Have you started your homework? Those kinds of things. We would go and speak to the teacher. We didn't have to wait till, school nights. But we would have active conversations. How are they doing? And even as a father, I would go. I remember having some conversations with teachers myself, making sure that everybody was straight and everybody was right. And so education is something that is hands-on. Parents have to do that. And so often they do that at elementary level. But by the time they are middle school or high school, they drop out, they disappear. But we stayed there to the very end with our children because we were interested in their development. We wanted them to be treated fairly, and that was a part of us being involved in the school system and their education.
I think I echo everything that Pastor Jefferson said. I think the only thing I would add is I didn't think that the school was their primary point of education. Their house was their primary point of education. And so field trips and television and everything became a lesson that then was connected to what did you read in school today. And I know that they were born in a generation, 13 and 19 now, 15 and 19. But I wasn't born in a generation where I could carry a screen in my hand. They always had a screen in their hands. Right, yeah, cell phones were the size of cinder blocks, right? So I tried to co-opt the screen. And so we watched documentary. And we talked about, what does this mean to you? And so using the cultural thing as a part of their education. So by the time they went to school, I'll never forget, my son went to St. Paul's, and it may have been in Oakland, and predominantly white private school. He comes home one day and he says, I had to explain to the teacher that she didn't understand something about black people. I said, oh God, it's just a matter before we get the email. But all the way through high school, he would be frustrated because he realized you didn't get that right about my history. I think one of the things that it's important for me is, and that I think we should incorporate, is to ensure that our homes become points of education. Now, we talked about this with Elite. What happens when you don't have the formal sense of education, right? At a certain point, you opt out, not because you're not interested, because they've gotten to geometry and you can't help with that lesson. And we got involved in the prenatal program that we were doing in the county, and trying to help parents understand that no matter what education you bring formally, you still have great influence in helping your child. Get tutored together, right? Don't feel embarrassed because your child has outpaced your formal education. So I think that's an important place, especially in low-driven educational communities. Sometimes we're ashamed to let our children know we don't know something. And we got to get past that shame and learn with them and not hide from them.
I love all the things you said. I'm a mom of 4 boys, ages 9 through, my oldest will be 23 this summer. And during COVID, they were all at home and I was working from home. My husband was working from home. That was a struggle. But one of the things that made it less so, especially this past year when kids were still online and then they went back into the classroom, was the relationship that we had with our children's teacher. And I think you were asking us earlier about this relationship, collaboration. What I loved that happened with this one particular teacher was how responsive, how collaborative, how accessible he was. He had a website, he had texting. I love that I could get on my phone and say, and we know that communication is really important when you're building these kinds of relationships between teachers and parents. And that wasn't what we had been experiencing in the schools. Before in schools, we were trying to find things, but so many teachers didn't have a website or web page or any information about their class. They wouldn't necessarily respond in a timely fashion to emails. If I called, I was told they would get back to me, and they got back to me when they got back to me. But during COVID, what shifted was they had to get back to you faster, and so they were coming up with all this, or using technology in different ways. And last year's teacher was terrific. He was really in partnership with us, responding quickly to inquiries, sending materials home. He became my son's favorite teacher, one of ours too. We saw the potential for collaboration because of effective communication. And like you, I also, because I'm an educator by profession and training, in the beginning of COVID, did a lot of supplementary education with my children, because what was happening was just insufficient. I had a kindergartner, and he was not going to sit in front of a screen. That just wasn't working. So we spent a lot of time as a family hiking, going to museums before they closed. I went to one of the last open museums, took a bunch of pictures, brought it home. We did art and stuff until it got to be too much for me to do. But we did spend a lot of our weekends out in nature as a family. We're doing that this coming weekend as well. Just kind of sitting down to dinner, just talking to folks. It doesn't matter if it's a single parent family, which is what I grew up in. I had divorced parents. They both sat us down, no television, nothing, just talking to us. Or if it's a two-parent household, that quality time listening to your children, talking with them, the rides to and from school, all that matters. All that shapes who our children are. I'm really proud of my sons. They're outstanding young men.
And all of your children, I've not met your children personally. I have to put my eyes on them. But I know your children, Pastor Jefferson, and yours, Dr. Quick, and just exceptional human beings. You've done a beautiful job. So now I'm going to dig in, because we have grandparents and parents that taught us that racism matters, right? A lot of things have to do with race. And we're finding out more and more how much. Florida is what I want to talk about now. Their attempts to control what is taught and how it's taught in classrooms, and their attempts to erase Blackness, Black culture, affirming Black spaces within their state. So I'd like to ask you a question about that. Do you agree that it is important to standardize and, if you will, control what our young people learn in school around Blackness, Black culture, through controlling the bibliographies of the classes that they're in? Should we control and ensure that every student gets just a standard, Americanized, if you will, curriculum? Or should there be affirming spaces for Black and brown students? What's going on in Florida, and what do you think? Is it the right thing to do?
I'll start this conversation because I know you all will end it. this thing called the woke legislation is a spoof. It is just the name of it is characterizing us in such a negative light. But I really believe that Florida is just indicative and a reflection of America. They have just codified it through legislation, but all of us, most of us, came from a kind of a whitewashed history, unless you had black teachers or black educators to tell you something different. To be honest with you, I learned more about black history in Atlanta in school, in college. I didn't know before the Mayflower. Said, what? There were black folks here before the Mayflower? Because in the school systems here in Vallejo, they didn't teach you that. You had no clue of that. So I think that that Florida is just a reflection of America. And we know that the governor, even though he is now declared a presidential candidate, is just playing from the Trump playbook. And that is to eliminate all of these cultural issues, cultural teachings and identifications throughout America. And it is a very serious thing. And I'll end with this. Next week, I'll be in Orlando, Florida, for a convention all week. One of the things that we have challenged the leadership of the organization, of my denomination, we can't afford to pour millions of dollars in their economy while this type of talk. Now, see, we negotiated these rates and all of this stuff prior to all of this becoming national, because post-COVID, all of these communities are trying to gain more people to come in. But now we can't, with good conscience, go and spend our dollar, our money, in a place that is systematically trying to eliminate our culture and our identity. But I say that Florida is America. Florida is kind of like the white backlash, which always happens when there's black progress. Then there's a backlash that always occurs systematically. We know that Obama, if there was no Obama, there probably would not have ever been a Trump. All of these backlashes. Anytime we move forward, there's always this pushback to take us back further than what we were before. And I just see Florida, again, as America. So I think it's nothing new, but it's just so bold and brazen what he's doing. But he's not the only one. Atlanta, Georgia, not just Atlanta, but Georgia itself is also, they did the same thing. They followed it. They followed the same type of legislation. So you have a lot of kickback in Georgia now where they're trying to eliminate black studies and black cultural things. So all the educators there are going crazy. They're going nuts. Tennessee, other states, Mississippi, who wants to live in Mississippi? Anyway, all of these Texas, all of our red states, our southern states, are moving that way. And I think as a collective, it's the only way we're going to be able to fight this thing is that we've got to be a part of the political process, because we know that the politics is where the policies are, where they derive. And so it's important for us to get involved there, because if we don't advocate from that place, if we don't put the right people in place, in office, we're going to see more of this.
Well, we see it in California too. I feel like it's not so far away. We have districts in California who want us to get rid of CRT, which isn't taught in public schools, who don't want educators educated in ways that are essential for our communities. But what I want to say about this is is something a little bit different. Florida is terrible, and you've said it, and I'm sure you'll say more. What I find interesting is how hungry educators actually are for the kinds of information that they're trying to repress. There's a hunger. So I teach at a university, and our program is centered, is grounded in critical theory. It's grounded in social justice principles. And so everything we teach is through this lens of critical social justice. And as well, we're talking as a faculty about abolitionist leadership principles and how that might connect to our work as well in educating leaders of schools and districts and systems. And students come to us, they say they come to us because they want that particular information and that education so that they can then understand and serve the communities in which they are leaders. So although DeSantis and others like him and of his ilk in California are trying to do kind of prevent folks from that information, actual educators are really hungry for that and desire and seek out programs and opportunities for that. They may shut it down politically there. They're just going to go on the internet. And they're trying to shut it down in schools so kids can't find this information in schools. But there are resources across the nation folks are putting together resources across the nation so that the children who are in these communities who are preventing them from understanding who they are and the histories of their communities can still have access to that information.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's, this is a continuation. We're still fighting the Civil War that never ended. We know that post-Reconstruction, a whole narrative was rewritten by the South. And Lee Atwater picked up on that with Richard Nixon. And we can follow the history of this. And as a person who studies race, I feel like two things have occurred. And it's a theme that I go back to why I thought it was important that elite be in place. You can never rely on a people to educate you who benefit from your ignorance. So I think it's a false expectation to think that education writ large in America is aimed towards educating poor black and brown people. It's not in their economic interest. Poverty makes money. And so nothing about this narrative is new nor surprising, and it's connected to the prison industrial complex, right? I think what is different is, and this is for me, is about consciousness, right, and access. What is different is our churches were created originally not just as places of worship, but places of education. And we bought into more westernized religion and turned into profit pimps over prophets. And I think it has now boiled down to having pastored churches in low-income communities. Our responsibility, because I know better, I have to push through the resistance I get to educate. I didn't come to church to hear about politics. I didn't come to church to do this, right? Well, that's what you're going to get here, right? And I think maybe about 10 years ago, I did 7 or 8 years ago, I did a Bible study series in which we laid out 5 books that every black boy could read and 5 books that every black girl could read. And I taught bits of those books and encouraged my members to buy them. We've got to go back to self-educating ourselves because we can't take for granted what we know and what we're conscious of. We know from these children that we're working with every day, they have no consciousness of it, right? And to have, for me now, we have a freedom school. We no longer meet on Saturdays. We meet on Sundays. We no longer meet on Sundays. We meet on Saturdays. And I have 4 Ivy League professors that are teaching these freedom schools. The class today is by Professor Rupin, Black Women in the Bible. And what my commitment is, I don't care if the public school tells you. I'm not waiting for them to tell you this. Come to me and I'll teach you this, and I'll give you access. And, when I was at Princeton and I worked with Cornell West, the one challenge I had for him is, who has access to you? I'm privileged to have it, but the very people you talk about, do they have access to you? What would it look like for you to retire from Princeton and go teach at Howard or somewhere else? And that didn't look well on my paper. He didn't like that. But I think we've got to now go back to this question of segregation and integration. We've got to go back to communities that don't have access to us. That's what's important about what's going on here, right? That I could hear the history that you've laid out. That I may not be able to take your class, but now I've learned from you today. And it is free to everybody. I think the last thing I want to say about this is we still lag in internet access. And that became more exposed for me when COVID came and we all had to go online. And I had members who said, well, I can't watch that. I don't have a way to watch that, right? And particularly my older members. And I was surprised by how many households with kids, right? And we faced this in schools, right? It was no problem for my kids to switch online to school because we had internet. But anybody who has to pay Comcast or Xfinity, and you got to pay that $120 a month for internet access, and you don't have it, they got triply hurt in COVID, right? So there's a number of things from a civil rights perspective that we need to be fighting institutions about to provide for our folks who still are on the back end of a lot of these resources.
I want to ask my next question, and it seemed like you may have had a thought. I think you may be able to fold it into this next question. And I was going to ask it a certain way, but I'm going to ask it differently through story. In high school, I came through at a time where there were stay 9. So if you were in stay 9, 1, 2, and 3, you tested in stay 9, 1, 2, and 3, which is the lower segment, you had classes together. If you tested in stay 9, 4, 5, and 6, you had classes, those mid-range classes together. And if you were in the higher stay 9, 7 through 9, you had classes together. And so I ended up being, because I tested well, in AP classes, advanced placement classes. My mother really lamented the fact that I pulled myself out of those classes. Here's why I did it. Because none of the black teachers were teaching those classes, number one. Number two, because the curriculum content did not include my experiences, the history or the experiences of my people. I felt it, I knew it. So I pulled myself out. So I want to ask you, and let me do part 2 of that. I attended UC Berkeley, as many of you know. They have one of the premier African American studies departments in the world. And so it was then that I thought, oh, this is where I can be exposed to some of those individuals that write the book. I said, UC Berkeley does not hire the person that does not write an author and is known globally for these things. So Ishmael Reed was my mentor, is my mentor. But long story short, it is then when the light bulb went off for me that I thought school can make an impact on who I am. I'm reading more about my people. My parents did a great job, but I'm reading more about my people in school. So all that to ask you the question, when did the light bulb go off for you? I know that you had the pleasure of going to historically black colleges. You grew up in DC. When did the light bulb in school go off for you? And what did CRT or any curriculum or professor have to do with that?
I don't think the light bulb was ever not on because I was getting those messages. from my mother and from my grandmother and my father. And then because, like I said earlier, I was in the gifted program, it was kind of always an expectation. But what got me moving forward, I didn't go to an HBCU. I went to Stanford. I went to a PWI. But I sent my son to an HBCU. And I sent my oldest son to Howard. And my second son is very interested in Morehouse. So I'll be talking with y'all about that later. What I remember, one of the light bulbs in high school was when, I went to this school that's now closed. Some schools are terrific, but they don't have lots of students. So these small schools, Oakland went through an economic downturn, and they have been trying to close our schools since the 80s, and they eventually did. But unfortunately, they don't look at the legacy of those graduates, because if they looked at the legacy of the graduates, they wouldn't have closed the school, because the graduates are now, they make the city proud, who we have become, what we've done, how committed we are to the Black community, to our community of Oakland, to one another. We stay in communication. But in 10th through 12th grade, I had these amazing African-American educators in my life, and white educators who really, really knew their stuff. And so before, you were asking us about culturally responsive education. And what I loved about, so I had terrific role models of, what education could be, and a lot of them did go to Berkeley and schools locally. I remember Mr. Wheat talking to us about going to Berkeley. So I had people who I didn't have to look far to figure out how to go to college. They were my teachers. They were in my classrooms. They looked like me. They were always talking about their experiences. I remember part of how I got to Stanford is because at some point I had shared, I don't even remember this, but it came out that I wanted to become a doctor, a medical doctor at the time. And so my counselor brought in this man. There were two counselors who came into the classroom. I was in my anatomy, physiology, or one of my science classes. And he comes in and he goes, "Oh, I want you to fill out this application. Just pull me out of class, and you need to fill it out by tomorrow." It's for the Stanford Medical Youth Science Program. The program still exists. Most of its graduates have become medical doctors, not me. I'm the PhD, but I still got the doctor. And these people knew me so well in this small school that they knew what I wanted, and they brought the resource to me. They had me fill out the form. They sent it off for me. I had an interview, and then I got into this summer program that opened up what Stanford University was. I'm like, oh, I want this. And then part of what the program did, it was a summer program, 5 weeks on the Stanford campus. We took classes, anatomy, physiology classes. We went to, it was just incredible. Look up smysp.org. We had mentors. Each of us in the summer program had a mentor. I had two. One, I think his name was Chris Flores. He's an MD now. But when I applied my senior year, so this program happens the summer of my junior year. My senior year, Christopher Flowers, that's his name, Christopher Flowers. I read my application to Stanford to him over the phone, and he listened and gave me feedback. That's how I applied. It was a Black man who is now probably in his, I don't know how old he is, in his 60s, probably a Black physician in process, who helped me apply to college. The other person, this becoming thing, this amazing educator, was Joan Lavin. Joan Lavin was my English teacher, and she taught me in such a way that showed such love and interest and belief in me. I'll never forget her bringing curriculum that looked like who I was to me. She introduced Black feminist thought to me. She introduced me to Alice Walker. I read so much of this. I didn't even know what I was doing, but she brought materials to me. So the how you make it and going on to college and all of this, then it was never a thought, was because all these people were bringing resources to my doorstep. I didn't have to go to my counselor and ask, because my counselor came to me. I didn't have to figure out if I was college material because the teachers were always talking about their college experiences as if we could do it too.
The light bulb came on for me. I started a program. When I say I started to attend a program that was originally an SAT prep program that turned in what was called at that time the Tanner Project, which today is called the Willie B. Atkins program. And Willie B. Atkins at that time was over special projects in the Vallejo Unified School District, along with Nona Bowman and so many others that were educators at that time. And they started a college prep program here in Vallejo. We were the first class there and end up going on a college tour. We were the first ones in '88 to go on that tour. But you know, we had the benefit of this community of people that believed in us. And the whole reason we would have this program was to prepare us for college. And, you know, I can think of all kinds of things. They talk to us about history, but they also talk to us about practical things on how to pack your clothes, how to, what it would be like to be in a college dormitory. Just so many aspects of what it was. So our vision, you know, words are visions or pictures. We could picture ourselves based on their conversations. I mean, you could see yourself. You couldn't see yourself not going there because week after week after week, we were getting these doses of who we were and who we would be. And that program was so instrumental. It was so instrumental in my life to have this community to basically, you know, invest in us so that we would become successful adults. And I'm so proud to see even today that program is still going strong. And I believe out of any program in the city of Vallejo, that one program is responsible for educating so many African Americans, so many of the alumnus or alumni rather of the Tanner / Willie B. Atkins program are doctors and lawyers and teachers and educators of all kinds. And it all started with Willie B. Atkins, who was a man who was incidentally the first black principal in the city of Vallejo, who came to an administrative role and did not just, and that was another thing, and this would be going off the subject. Those educators at that time worked together. They had different alliances, different associations. So whether they were, regardless to which school you went to, they would come together and synergize and figure out how they were going to help the test scores go up. I can remember a teacher of mine, my mother, talking to a teacher at another school, a black teacher. Well, you know, we know about the tests and we got the insight and whatnot. And they didn't have the answers, but they had the insight. And come on and let's get these kids together, and they would work together to educate us and invest so that we would have high test scores and so on and so forth. But the light bulb came on through the Willie B. Atkins program, or at that time the Tanner program.
Thank you. And your daughter is our Willie B. Atkins mentor for young people.
Look at there.
Yes, isn't that beautiful?
Again, I'm the Malcolm Gladwell example of an outlier. I went to Washington, D.C. public schools. So the structures that supported you all weren't in place for me. And I'm dyslexic. So I was told by the school system that I was retarded. So my educational background is a little bit different in that my support systems came from my house. Didn't come from schools. There was one teacher, Gloria Tucker, who came to see me at Morehouse, my 5th grade teacher, when I got to college. So I didn't have this sort of circle the wagons, you can do this. And as my mother tried to get me to better education, she sent me I went to a white military high school. And, they were like, okay, you're going to graduate, what are you going to do next? It was not, you should look at this college. None of us, my roommate at Morehouse we went to high school together. None of us were brought to the office and said, apply for this. We were all said, you should think about the military, right? So I had a slightly opposite experience, not only a learning difference, but a structure that was not pushing me towards something. My home did. And I think my first glimpse of it is I ran for citywide office and was elected to youth council member at large and got mentored by Marion Barry, who began a PhD, I think, in chemistry. Incredibly smart man. And he exposed me to Harold Washington and Jesse Jackson. And I ended up in rooms with all these men who gave me this moment, right? My moment didn't come from schools. My moment came from walking with people who were like, yo, this is how you make a move. I guess my academic moment came when I got to Morehouse. And I had never been surrounded by this many black people who were this smart. I had, everywhere you looked, there was a black person and they were all the valedictorian in their class, and I'm sitting there like, yo, I barely got in, but, I'm here, right? I'm going to take remedial reading, and then, being in that environment was life-changing. And it wasn't just Morehouse. Everywhere you looked, Spelman and Clark and Morris Brown, and all the professors were black. And they all looked like you. And if you missed a class, I remember missing a class, and he came knocking on my door like, where were you this afternoon? And I was like, yo, are you serious right now? And that is why I'm so keen on us educating us, right? And building institutions that see us. Because if you don't have the tremendous gifts at home, somewhere there's got to be a place. Was it Gabriella today? Right? It was Gabriella today at the brunch who was like, I bounced from school to school, and nobody would let me have a voice. But when I got here, I found my voice. That's why this is so necessary for those of us who didn't have the other opportunities.
I have 2 more questions for you all. This has been fascinating for me. I've learned so much. You're all friends, but I've learned so much today that I didn't know. So thank you. I'm a public school educator. People would think because we're now a charter school that I'm a charter school educator. No, I'm a public school educator, and there's some powerful educators in all systems doing extraordinary work. One of the benefits of a charter school is that you have an appointed board. So our board consists of people like Tasha Johnson, who's in the audience, just a leader in her own right in the community, will be a guest one day. Our board consists of professors, Vajra Watson, who is a friend of yours, who got early tenure or whatever it is. You speak that language, I don't, at Sac State. Our board consists of community people. You were a founding board member, Dr. Quick. And so because of that, I can come to this board and be challenged. You ask great questions and you're helping me build, but you challenge me. And I love that as an intellectual. Typical boards, public school boards, all you have to do is be nationally, there are states where you just have to be 18. California, you have to be 21. You don't need to have any education. You can just be a community person. I want to, run for school board. And so just talk to me about the politics of that, about the fact that anyone who is either 18 or 21 and breathing can run these multi-million, in some cases, billion-dollar enterprises called public education systems. What do you think about when you think about that? And then I'll go into the last two questions.
Well, my experience here, and I can say it because I don't live here any longer, so I'm real free, is everyone comes to a board with an agenda. In the elite board, you knew our agenda. We were all on common ground. I'm not sure if I bifurcate the qualifications based upon education in public systems of election as much as I do on intention. Public boards that are elected leave space for white supremacy to live openly and unabashed. As long as the person, whether they are 20 and a PhD or 30 and an imbecile, is not the primary motive. It's who can raise enough money and get you enough votes to get you in that seat. We know from Vallejo Public Schools that we had people in office who were not qualified to tie most shoes, but they were doing the bidding of other people because they were propped there. So I think the difficulties of a democratic republic, and it's a whole different conversation because I think we're misguiding and believing we live in a democracy. We don't. The difficulty in a democratic republic, such as ours, is it's not merit-based. It's oligarchy-driven. And that's why you can have a Harvard-trained law review scholar by the name of Barack Obama be questioned as legitimate or illegitimate by one of the most narcissistic and ignorant individuals created in America's soil, Donald Trump. The qualifications are not necessarily the issue. That's what we've learned as black people. From a mental health standpoint, I argue we put so much pressure on ourselves. You got to be 5 times as smart as the person you're in the classroom. It's well-intentioned, but it can be very painful to have to represent a whole group of people everywhere you go, right? And to carry the weight of saying, I got to work to represent everybody that's come before me. We now see from psychological studies that that's a tremendous form of trauma in and of itself. But we were told to do that because then we might be accepted. And I think what we're discovering is that it's never been about how smart you are or how qualified you are. It has always been about how we navigate white supremacy. And I think the safety, I love Dr. Bishop. She's like a poker player. She has this ability to reduce herself, almost to sucker you into making a bid you can't handle. I'm not really an educator. You all went to Stanford. I'm just a little public school teacher, right? Yeah, I love that, as if to make you feel good about yourself. We watched you in 2 different settings, and Pastor Jefferson can talk about this probably better than I can. We watched you try to negotiate a board with people who were not your intellectual peers. Their one drive was to keep black and brown students in their place. And I will never forget bringing 100 people to that boardroom one week. And an older white woman stood up to address you. And she kept saying, Ramona. Remember that? She kept saying Ramona. And people were like, Dr. Bishop. And she said, well, Ramona. And finally we had enough. And we shut the meeting down. She was not going to make another comment. She was supported by the white supremacists on that board. Some of them were educated. The last thing I'll say about agendas is we know here that you got to be careful about the agenda of people with brown skin. Because not all of them have a black liberation interest. They have an interest of staying in office and being the mediators of mediocrity between the larger white world and black people whom they're supposed to represent. So that the qualifications, even for us, are not black skin and I got an education. The Willie Lynch in them is still real. The self-hate. So I think if there is a distinction to be made between a public board and a charter board, it's the incredible privilege of being able to find people aligned with a common mission that are willing to make common sacrifices, right? So that our early board, you had PhDs in education and, black college graduates. We were all scrubbing bathroom floors to get that building ready. We were all painting walls to get that building because we had a common vision. So that's how I view that question. And
I really can't improve on that because that really is the comparison and contrast between both boards. We saw how the other board operated so often, and it's so critical because whoever's over the board is about policy. They're policy makers. And our children are direct recipients of whatever decisions that they make. It also taught us that it was also important for us to be a part of the game. And that was to make sure that we also worked collectively to elect the right folks to sit in the right seats who would eventually make the policies for the children. But that became increasingly more difficult based on what you just said, because sometimes those of us that look like us were not really for us. They were for themselves. And in a board like Elite, a private board, as you've already very well articulated, we had one mission. We wanted to make sure that this school not only existed, but that it thrived and that it not only met, but exceeded expectations. Our only desire is to see these children educated in the best possible way that we could see that. None of us on this board had any political aspirations, because what we have found that many people in the public board, they really wasn't interested in the children. They were interested, it was a stepping stone. So I'll run for school board at this time and serve on the school board for maybe 1 or 2 terms. Then I'll run for city council. And then if I run then to mayor and so on and so forth. So it was, they were rising on the backs of our children, which they had no concern about as much as their own political agendas. So it goes back to what you said. Agenda is really the difference, in my opinion, of the 2 different boards.
I come from Oakland, so not Vallejo. But I was involved in leadership in my high school at the time, back in the day, in the 80s. And I grew up going to school board meetings, being a liaison to the superintendent's office, and then going to school board meetings for political purpose, to advocate for the continuance of my high school because they were trying to close it. And we would do the sit-ins and we would do the going up to speak and whatnot. And that gave me a terrific political education because I saw how invested folks were in closing my high school because it was deemed too small. But what was happening was black and brown children were getting wonderfully educated and doing well. And if you look at the alumni I said before, you're going to see some incredible things. I think the potential of school board for people as young as 21 is tremendous because what I think about is the potential of young people who've recently graduated to then sit on the board and use that experience to then advocate for the best education, as you said, for the children in the community. I think there's tremendous potential for them, and so I wouldn't want to see those that number increased, but I want to see us put some resources behind those young people we all know who exist in our communities who have vision and commitment to getting them into office, and then to kind of using school leadership and community. Sometimes people have titular leadership, so they have the title of the president, but then you have those social leaders who don't have any titles, but who everybody seems to follow. Those folks, I want them also sitting on the board with the folks who haven't been to school in 40 years and who don't really know and care about and don't understand the culture of and the challenges of the community. I want our young people on boards more often, and people, the parents who are who've had some challenging experiences with education. I can get into the history of Vallejo and just say, for example, the city owes the black and brown members of the community an apology for how they've educated them and their children. And these folks would be well placed to sit on the board because they know through their experience what the problems are and then where the potential for great work is.
Thank you. Again, we're coming to a close. This is a big question. So I'm going to ask you to meter your responses just time-wise, but it's still a big question. So if we have to go a little bit over time, then we will. Elite has secured a multi-million-dollar investment to purchase a high school in the downtown area. And we're in the final processes of all the approvals with the city, but the money is there. The check is written. We see this move as the beginning of the revitalization of downtown. I'd like to know your thoughts on the impact our high school can have, first on the downtown area and over time on the city at large.
I don't know why I turned it off. I'll go first. What we have the opportunity to do is, as you have already indicated, to revitalize downtown. This property sits in a very strategic place near City Hall, near other outlets like the ferry system. So you have access to even folks from San Francisco and other areas who are coming in those areas. It's a diamond down there, but it's also symbolic of what I think sometimes we've thought about. It's not only a place of education, but it is a place of power, because education is power. It is a place that has the potential to draw all types of empowerment there. You know, we can do a lot. It's multifaceted. But anytime you own something and you own it in a downtown area, you have just come to a place of power. And I don't want to make too much of that, but it is influence. And I think that the elite students will be so empowered being down there in this wonderful facility that we're working on. I'm so glad that we do have the finance to do it. And we're just looking for the manifestation of it and for us to be able to walk through there. But it means more than just education. It means influence.
I think from a development perspective, anyone who has studied presidents of successful large institutions, or at least on the college and university level, recognize that they leverage public-private partnerships in revitalizing communities. Dr. Jonathan Holloway, the first African-American president at Rutgers University, entered a major and dynamic partnership with the Robert Wood Johnson Hospital System and Johnson & Johnson, and revitalized all of downtown New Brunswick around the university. And what that allowed them to do was to create a number of things. One, major anchor institutions. Our downtown needs an anchor institution. Right now, it does not have one, unless one's been built in the 2 years I've been gone. But secondly, from an educational standpoint, it offers students the possibilities not only of being financial contributors, but to be able to leave class and get a job, to walk down the street and go to get a job. It allows access to resources that are downtown. But then it draws other people, right? Having worked in community development, when I was a lobbyist for Atlanta Public Schools, what we realized is a major corporation is not going to come into a city where those children are not going to get educated. So if you want to attract Coke and IBM and Xerox, the first thing that their global executives are going to ask is, are our employees going to have access to world-class education, right? Because I'm not going to be able to recruit C-suite executives who can't send their kids to a good school. So that's second. I think third is not a point that needs to be understated here in our city. Development has been driven by personality rather than the dynamic possibilities that diversity brings in any development opportunity. Imagine an elite downtown with corporate partners who offer internships and all those types of things. So from a development standpoint, it makes absolute sense. And that would be the miracle, right? Because to give elite that type of access for Black and brown students is not on the top of the priority list for some in our city. Which, as a closing statement, I just want to say my most deep appreciation and admiration for the two of you, for what is happening here, what the possibilities mean nationally in places where people for generations have been in institutions that have not served them well. This is liberation activity. This is what our great-grandparents dreamed about. And not only does it mean entering a system, it means co-opting a system. And it means a response to Audre Lorde's challenge. Can we use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? And elite, I think, is a challenge to the negative answer that she gave to that question. And so I just want to honor you were doing this work long before I got here. Whether it's Osby Davis or anybody else, you have stuck your neck out for a lot of people to progress in this city. And I'm a great admirer of you for that and appreciative that you opened yourself up to me to educate me. And I can't say enough about the underrated educator on my left. You know, I'm going to say this publicly every chance I get. every major force in this city was aimed at breaking your will. Every major force. Angry because test scores were rising, angry because children were graduating, angry because expulsion rates were going down, angry because they were mad that grant money was coming. And took it away. But the effort to dehumanize you, to scandalize your name, to make you doubt yourself, would have broken a lot of people. You took that and gave birth to something that is graduating children tomorrow. So I can't give you enough respect and credit for that. Congratulations to both of you.
You know, I always call Dr. Bishop the reformer. And no reformer in his or her time is celebrated. So often, unfortunately, it's after their passing. We don't want to wait till then. We celebrate you tonight for what is happening tomorrow. And so thank you for your resiliency and for hanging in there and your tenacity, and we are looking for a great day tomorrow.
You know, I want to take up what you said about the potential of downtown and those partnerships, because that's what I was thinking about when you talked about where the school was going to be located. And so I sniffed around to see what was down there and what was happening downtown. And clearly they have a plan in addition to what Elite is doing, and it's exciting. It's particularly exciting for me because I was thinking about, I've lived through this. I've lived through the actual partnerships that you're talking about. That school that they closed had partnerships with corporations. I worked at East Bay Mud in high school, which is a terrific job. I didn't work, well, I did for a minute, but I didn't work for long at Burger King. East Bay Mud came up and offered me an office position and showed me what corporate life could be like if I decided I wanted to go that way. And so it was a visioning very early in my youth. I was 16, 17 years old, and I thought, oh, I could work for these people. Again, people who had degrees, who were running divisions and whatnot, who wrote letters for me for college and scholarships and whatnot. These are all wonderful potentials for the young people of Vallejo and something they deserve. It would be a reparation, if we may, for these young people and their parents who've not had access to these opportunities in the ways that they should have. And so I love this idea of a downtown elite in partnership with the local businesses and albeit the larger corporations and the city hall and whatever else is there, because assuredly you have young people who are interested in that. And given the opportunity, like my child had at Davis High School, or Da Vinci High School, which was in Davis, where they had an internship coordinator whose sole job was to make sure that young people had internships. And you know what that looks like when they apply to college, right? Oh, look at this person, how involved they are in the community. They have the grades, they have the test scores, they have the recommendations. Look at what their letter of application says. And look at all these activities in the community. They would be well placed in our school. These are kinds of privileges that children are then afforded, that put them ahead of the pack when they apply to universities. I experienced that too. And so I love this idea of equipping our young people with every privilege that we've never had consistently across the community. And then this idea of elite in downtown is kind of a full circle. When I started the conversation, I started talking about where Black people went to school, in a hotel downtown, because that's where they placed us. It's almost like I thought about that history and how interesting that would be to talk with them through that and even see what their family's connection would be from a genealogical, historical standpoint, because probably they don't know. They may, maybe some of their family wasn't there in 1911, because again, many came through the Great Migration in the 40s. But some might be, there were not zero black people in Vallejo in that time. There were enough to have a school. And so I think that this would be a point of history return for the young people to kind of look into, to see, what our legacy in downtown has been. And I celebrate them with you as well. I remember when you were in Vallejo as superintendent and coming in, and the time you took to meet with me and the time you took to introduce me to your cabinet. And I remember when Vajra said, you need to know her, you need to study her, and I couldn't because I had a study going. So it's such a delight to be in community with you. Thank you all for celebrating her the way you did.
Closing question. This panel has been about, and thank you for all, means everything to me. This panel has been about Vallejo, past, present, and future. We graduate our first class, as you've indicated, tomorrow. Gabriela, amazing. Today she said at the brunch, I felt muted by school until I got to your school. And it's a place where everybody affirmed and cared about me. And Gabriela is on her way to being. She can be anything she wants to be. She wants to go to Berkeley, so we're going to make that happen. The other thing that's happening, going to public-private partnerships, is we've connected with a group called Inroads, and what they do is do early internships for young people that are going into whatever they want to go into, whether it's the Googles of the world. All of the major corporations come to this group for their interns. And they watch them from high school going through their bachelor's degree and out into the world. Inroads will pay for 40, I believe it's up to 40. It went from 20 to 40 in the last week of our young people to go to Georgia this summer. They don't have to pay a thing. And they're going to go to Morehouse. They're going to go to Spelman. So things like that are happening at Elite. As you think about Vallejo's past, its present, and its future through the work of Elite and through the work of any other powerful educator out there, what do you think about? What has been left unsaid today? And those are going to serve as your closing remarks.
When I think about it, again, we go back to the context that you gave in the very beginning of 1911 and the struggle that black people had in Vallejo from that time and even beyond that time. One thing that some people don't know about the NAACP is that our chapters, our branch was one of the first branches. I believe it was 1908 was the founding, which was very important. And so the struggle was very early to have the need for NAACP in its kind of inception. To come to 2023, the struggle is still continuing. There is no end to the struggle. And this is something I think that every generation must understand. There is no arrival. There's no place that we'll ever arrive. I think that I'll be fighting, and I think that generations and generations, we're talking about the future, will continue that fight. But I think the difference is that they'll have an institution that they didn't have previously to do it in a different way and to come from a different framework. And I think that this genesis of this organization, of this institution, and the potential that it has for generations to come is unmeasurable. You can't quantify what it's going to do and how it's going to impact our community, but we can just know that the sky is the limit.
I think about when a major general went to Savannah to meet with a group of black preachers and asked them what they wanted after the Civil War. And the black preacher says, we want 40 acres and a mule. They didn't want anything but the opportunity to succeed. And I think that's all people of color in our nation have ever asked for. We just want an opportunity to succeed. I think what elite represents is two things. One, the birth of something out of what looked dark. That was a dark period in our city. It was not just dark on the school board. We were dealing with police shootings. We were dealing with rapid poverty. It was dark in every aspect. And even in our political situation, we were in fights with Fairfield and the people who said they were Democrats, right? It was just, yeah, we were fighting everybody on every side, and we were also fighting within ourselves. Friendships were being fractured, and so out of that darkness, something rose, and I think the story of the beginning of Elite is very important to be told. And I really think there's a lot of synergy between the downtown research and the hotel and the reoccupation of that building. I think the connection between those 2 points ought to be accentuated. I am a believer, and I'm finding myself to be more Garveyan as I get older. I'm a believer that if you don't own it, you can't control it. And as we laid out today, it was the independent institutions in this city, you and other people, that didn't have to take folks' money, right? We could speak truth because our bill was going to get paid anyway. It made me think, the New York Times came and did an article, remember, and it was right before we got the first black chief. That was the fight we were doing. And I got a call after the article was published, and the reporter said, Dr. Quick, I do need to ask you a question. I said, okay. He says, we got an anonymous tip that you were on the police payroll. And I said, well, I don't know who told you that, but can you make sure they send my check to the right address, because I ain't got it yet. But it was a very important moment, because the suggestion was that it's impossible in the American context to be black and to be independent. You got to be bought by somebody, right? It's impossible to be educated and independent and fight for unless somebody owns you. And I said to this reporter, I said, you work for the New York Times. I'm sure you've already done this research. He said, yeah, I know there's nothing to it, but they wanted me to ask you. I said, well, you've asked, and no, that's not the case, but I'm willing to be bought if somebody has enough money, right? And he sort of laughed, and I laughed. But what Elite represents for the future is an independent place with a clearly defined agenda. And my prayer is that that's never sacrificed. That its sole goal is the intellectual development of a people who have been historically left behind, and that whatever it takes to keep it financially invested in its own interest continue in perpetuity. And if that happens, it will become more and more dangerous in this context. And what we need is dangerous, safe spaces. And that's the future.
What I'm taking away is the value of community and the history of community, the history of this town. I don't have much to add beyond what you two have said, which is so beautiful. My work really now with Vallejo is to capture the stories of the generation of great migrants before we lose them. So I'll just say that if folks want to contact me about this study, they can email greatmigrationstudy.com, I think it is. And you could probably put that on your website, because I think it's really important to bring the history of the community back to the community. I see how many times in the conversation we've referred back to that history to understand our present. I am a fan of yours, and so I think they've said everything I need to say.
We want to thank each one of our amazing panelists. I'm sure that this is going to get so much attention because what you've lifted up and talked about is speaking to the heart and spirit and mind of a community organizer out there, or a parent out there, or an educator out there, or a preacher, or a superintendent, or someone out there is listening to you, and they've been inspired by you. And there are students listening too. So they have your stories as examples of pathways that they can follow toward their success. So I appreciate each one of you, friends. Thank you. Thank you to each one of you for listening to our Elite Public Schools' very first podcast. This will be one of many. We will do one per month when we open school after the summer. If you're interested in enrolling your students at Elite Public Schools, we are filling fast. Every year we add about 100 students and we cap it. We're at about 80, so you want to get your applications in quickly. ElitePublicSchools.org. I'm Dr. Ramona Bishop. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.